it was a massive shock for everyone, essentially, because central Beirut is an area that's considered safe. Lots of people who escaped the southern suburbs or the south and east of Lebanon went to central Beirut, believing that they could seek shelter there. So what really happened is an atmosphere of shock. This is the third time that that Israel hits inside Beirut's municipal borders during by the past few weeks. So people are kind of just trying to gather themselves and figure out what to do, because it does feel like Beirut is becoming less and less safe as we speak.
And tell us about that part of Beirut. We understand this hit residential buildings. What kind of people live in that part of the city?
Well, it's a heavily residential area. It's more or less of a middle-class area, I want to say. It's not the fancy downtown, but it's also not a poor area. So essentially, yeah, it's heavily residential. The French embassy to Lebanon and the Beirut Lebanese National Museum are not far from it either. So it's very much, a very densely populated place where many people just go on around their daily lives and go about their days. So the strike really surprised everyone.
And Nada, I think we can show the audience some live pictures now of excavators and people working on the site there of those strikes, sifting through the rubble, trying to find survivors. You mentioned that growing sense of fear that Beirut may not be safe. Have many people fled the city in the last day or so since the intensity of some of these strikes in the capital intensified?
There have been some people who fled Beirut altogether. Some of them believe that essentially those who have, for example, homes in the mountains or have relatives who live outside of the city, many of them escaped and decided it would be safer to stay away for now. The difficulty, however, obviously Beirut is the capital and the largest city. Shelters and homes are filling up all across Lebanon. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to find places to leave to, because Beirut very much is the center of the country. So if Beirut is not safe anymore, people are going to start wondering, what are they going to do?
And what about things like communications? I mean, you're obviously able to speak to us tonight, but is there a concern that over time things like power, communications, water and other essentials might be cut off?
Definitely, because, for example, in some southern regions, there is now currently an internet shutdown, and it's difficult to get electricity and water and services because some of the buildings providing these services have either been hit or they have had some maintenance issues that repair people just cannot go and fix. Right now, as we speak, the main internet provider is not being able to work in some areas of the south, and it's saying that its workers simply cannot reach the buildings to go and fix it because it's constantly under Israeli attacks. There is a fear for sure. The country, save for the areas that are regularly bombed, is largely still functioning. But if we're going to have a repeat of the scenario we saw in the 2006 war, where Israel hit one of Lebanon's power plants and tried to kind of shut down the country entirely and besiege it, then we are in for some really dark periods.
And what are you hearing there in Beirut about the intended target of this attack? Have you heard anything from either Israel or officials there in Lebanon or from Hezbollah about what the intended target was?
From what Hezbollah has told Hezbollah sources have told several media outlets by now, including Reuters, it seems that Wafi Safa, who was allegedly the target of the strike, has survived, as you mentioned earlier. But I think the feeling is that even though obviously Hezbollah is opposed by many people in Lebanon, including Wafi Safa himself, it does feel like killing him in a highly resilient people. They feel like this is not the way to kind of fulfill their opposition to Hezbollah, because at the end of the day, civilians are paying the price, and Israel deciding to strike a highly densely populated area whose population has increased lately because displaced people have fled there. And we're seeing reports of people who have fled the south now being subjected to bombing in this area. It's being met with quite a bit of horror, essentially. People are not convinced by Israel's methods to try to kill Hezbollah officials, the way they're doing it, at least.
And we're just seeing more of those live pictures of those sites of the attacks. Nada, tell me, how well equipped is Lebanon to deal with these kinds of strikes? It's obviously no stranger to conflict, but what sort of facilities or what sort of protections do any buildings have from airstrikes, if any?
Lebanon is unfortunately not prepared at all, I would say. Aside from the infrastructure not being very strike-friendly, there are some bomb shelters in Beirut and other areas because they date back from the days of the Civil War last century, where people used to hide in bomb shelters. But aside from that, Lebanon has been dealing with the worst economic crisis of its history, which the World Bank believes is one of the three worst in the last 150 years. So the state has essentially collapsed. The economy has collapsed a few years ago. And, you know, people don't have state, for example, we have an hour or two of state electricity a day, whereas most people rely on private generator providers. And the same applies to internet services, water services, and anything of that kind. So it does feel like the many wounds that were inflicted on Lebanon over the past few years are only exacerbating the struggles that people are going to be facing now.